Okay, that's 2 o'clock, so I'm just going to begin. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon.
The link tells us about how to teach reading.
Oh, I can just hear. If everyone could put their mics off, that would be great. Thank you. So you're here, you know that I am going to be talking about the science of reading today. This is obviously a massive area. I'm not really going to be able to do it justice, but I'm hoping that if I speak quickly, I'll be able to do about 40 minutes or so, and we'll have maybe 5 to 7 minutes left at the end for questions. So if you do have things that occur to you on the way through, please feel free to pop those into the chat. So about me, really, there's nothing to say. I'm a literacy consultant. I'm a member of the Reading Reform Foundation UK. I'm a member of the International Foundation for Effective Reading Instruction. Both of these organisations campaign for research-informed reading instruction in English. So what is the science of reading exactly? Well, if you're on Twitter, you might have seen the hashtag SOR, which stands for Science of Reading, and you might have had a wee thought about, well, what does this actually involve? Well, the science of reading, it's a vast body of interdisciplinary scientific research, all related to reading. It's massive. It covers thousands of studies, and it's international in nature because it's, international research from across the world, and it's also been carried out in multiple languages. So it includes all of these areas or components of science and lots more besides. It's also not fixed. It's not done and dusted. This is being added to constantly all the time. It's important to know that the science of reading isn't just phonics. There's a lot more to it than that. In fact, these are the 5 pillars of reading as described by the National Reading Panel in the year 2000 in America. So you will find research in the science of reading to do with all of these areas. The tendency, though, to focus on phonics is usually because it's the one component that teachers perhaps haven't been trained in or tend not to know enough about in terms of what the research or what the science says about phonics. So that's why there tends to be a bit of a focus on it. You could, I could talk about this one slide for the full 45 minutes. You could say that there is a kind of hierarchy in the 5 pillars when it comes to independent reading. Now, of course, we can develop children's vocabulary, their comprehension, even their phonological awareness through reading to them. But for their independent reading, if we want children to be able to understand what they read, that's going to depend very much on their knowledge of their vocabulary, how many words they know. It's also going to depend on their knowledge of the world, their general knowledge, but they're also going to have to be able to read fluently in order to attend to meaning at the same time as they read, particularly when it comes to complex text. So how do we get fluency? Then we need to have phonics. We need to have accurate and secure and fluent decoding. So that's where your phonemic awareness and phonics both come in. So the phonics really is a prerequisite to having good comprehension. Now, the year 2000 is quite a while ago. I'm sure if it was being redone today, I'm certain they would be adding in another pillar for knowledge, because we now know the crucial role that knowledge plays in children's comprehension. Children's comprehension, I can't say this enough, it depends on their vocabulary knowledge and on their knowledge of the world, their general knowledge. So it's important that we're putting the knowledge back on the table in primary. If it was up to me, I'd also be adding another pillar for reading for pleasure, because really that's what I'm passionate about. This is how I got into the science of reading in the first place, because I wanted every child to benefit from reading for pleasure. And I'm not talking about that today, but we know through research the myriad of benefits reading for pleasure can provide. And as I've brought it up, why do children read more? How can we get them reading for pleasure? Well, research actually shows that children's reading ability is what determines how much they choose to read, rather than vice versa. So previously we might have suspected or thought that if we make reading exciting enough, if we make it engaging enough, then children will be motivated and want to read. But actually, we now know that the opposite is true, that it's success in reading that leads to motivation for reading for pleasure. So, I tend to say it quite a lot when I do training is, remember, you can't read for pleasure if you can't actually read. So there have been 4 major international inquiries into the teaching of reading. And what's interesting is they all had the same conclusion. They all concluded that the most effective way to teach children to read is through systematic phonics. So that was in America in the year 2000, Australia in 2005. It says here the UK, now this was the Rose Review in 2006, was the final report. And although it says UK, it is actually only England that have taken on board the findings of Sir Jim Rose's report. And the most recent one here, actually, this was published in March of this year from Canada and Ontario. This was a 3-year inquiry into the teaching of reading, specifically focused on children with reading disabilities. I really would encourage you to look into this and look this up, because this 3-year inquiry has 157 recommendations, and pretty much all of them are entirely relevant to Scotland as well. So you've got the link there. I do have some links that I'm going to put into the chat for you too, if they're going to work. Yep, there we are. And there's also a free audiobook that you can listen to the summary as well, if you wish. So some of those recommendations include things like in initial teacher education, teachers must be trained in the science of reading. It must be research-informed reading instruction that they're using, and teachers must know how to teach children with reading difficulties and dyslexia how to read. And I know that we're all familiar in Scotland with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It was mentioned this morning in Gail Gorman's keynote, of course, and this is a fabulous thing to have at the centre of our practice. And of course, we're very aware that the right to education is included in this. But I don't know if we're aware that, for example, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that learning to read is not a privilege, but a basic, essential human right. And I would love us in Scotland, when we're thinking about rights-based education, that we include this, that learning to read is a right that belongs to every child and not just some children. Now, in life, when we learn, some things are natural. Some things are easy or natural to learn because we would term them as being, biologically speaking, primary. So examples of things that are biologically primary are things like walking and talking. You will learn those naturally. You're primed for those as a human. And as long as someone is speaking to you and barring any other impediments, you will, of course, learn to walk and talk. And that will develop naturally, but in your own time as well. Both of my children were late walkers, but they got there in their own time. However, when it comes to reading, it's different. Reading is, biologically speaking, secondary. It's not natural. Reading is an invention, it's a human invention. We've actually been speaking for 50,000 years, but we've only been reading and writing for around 5,000 years. So in evolutionary terms, it's a fairly recent invention. So our brains aren't primed to read, they're not ready to read, and it's not something that's going to happen naturally. We have to teach children what the alphabet is, how it works, and how to use it. Other secondary examples would be learning to read music, for example, or learning to swim. learning to swim, again, is secondary. It's not natural. That's why we don't throw P1s into the deep end of the swimming pool. That's why we give them swimming lessons. So because our brains are not primed for reading and they're not wired for reading, and it's not a natural thing for humans to do, this also means that there's no kind of magical developmental milestone. Children aren't just going to one day wake up and be ready for reading and writing in the same way that one day they will take their first step, when they're a toddler. That doesn't exist. So we must be very, very careful in the early years, in primary one in particular, from holding back children from reading. We should really be teaching every child to read in primary one and helping those who struggle. We should be helping them to keep up. That is our job. And if, for example, a child presents with, let's say, poor phonemic awareness, that's not a reason to say you're not ready yet. That's actually a red flag. If someone has poor phonemic awareness, that can be an indicator that they could potentially have dyslexia or develop dyslexia or similar reading type difficulties. It's actually a sign that we need to up our efforts, and we shouldn't withhold the teaching of reading for any reason. Every day that we delay the teaching of reading, that attainment gap is getting bigger. Reading is the ticket to getting out of the gap. So you're not primed for reading. Your brain doesn't come, already installed with the reading program in it. We have to do that work ourselves. We actually have to wire up the brain inside and program it for reading. And as teachers, that's really our job, to ensure that we're doing all the right things to help children wire their brains so they can read. And it's even harder than that, because we actually have to take existing areas of our brains and we have to repurpose them. We have to reuse them and get them doing new things that they didn't do before. But before I talk more about the brain, we really have to put this to bed, this one. Children learn in different and unique ways. Well, children don't learn in different and unique ways. Actually, children are more the same than they are different when it comes to learning. And when it comes to reading, we actually all use the same brain structures to read. And in fact, we're all constrained by the brain's architecture when it comes to reading. Your reading brain really is remarkable when you think about it. On the screen here, what we can see is side view of a skull, and down at the kind of bottom left-hand side of the brain, there's this little area, and we can see the wee black arrow pointing to it. This is called the visual word form area, or actually the easiest thing to call it is just simply a letterbox, because this is the area in your brain that enables you to read. This is the area that responds to printed words. It recognises letters and letter strings, and it allows you to read. It's actually the neuroscientist, the French neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene, who dubbed this visual word form area the letterbox, which I really like. So it's this small region in your brain, and in fact, you can scan pretty much any human, stick them in an MRI, and you will find this letterbox in the same place, give or take a millimetre. And actually, which I find astounding, this is regardless of language. So whether you speak French, German, Arabic, Italian, Mandarin, whatever it is, whatever that language is, if we scan you, we're still going to find that letterbox in the same place. But what's miraculous is this is not present at birth. The letterbox isn't there when you are born. It's something we must build. So here now we have a brain scan. This is a typical 9-year-old who is a good reader. We can see different bits lighting up in different colours. So where we see the red bits, that corresponds to the brain lighting up when it recognises a face. The yellow part, that's the brain recognising objects. And then this lime green part, this is the actual letterbox, and it's lighting up in when it's recognising words, letters and letter strings. And we can see it quite clearly there, the little lime green letterbox. So what your brain is actually doing here, it's using the parts of your brain that recognise faces, that recognise objects, and it's taking a bit of that brain and it's adapting it. It's repurposing bits of that brain to do the job of reading. But to do all that wiring up, to really connect these neural networks and these pathways in the brain for the letterbox, it takes years of practice and of repetition to build those neural networks. And another, quite stark fact is that we only find the letterbox in literate humans. The letterbox will only exist if we scan your brain, if you can actually read. So here we have a typical brain scan. This time it's a 9-year-old, but this time they're dyslexic. And what do we notice? We have the same yellow parts, the same red parts, but this time the lime part is missing. That letterbox isn't present. And actually, interestingly, from Stanislas Dehaene's work, he actually studied people who had strokes, so people who could read previously but had strokes and lesions which affected the letterbox area, and they were then unable to read because the letterbox had been damaged. So what is happening here then in the brain of a dyslexic child if they don't have the letterbox? Does it mean they can't learn to read? No, it just means they haven't learned yet, or rather, they haven't been taught yet. The teaching hasn't taken place to enable them to build that letterbox, to build those networks, to build those neural pathways that are required for reading. So a little bit of a recap then. A non-reading brain looks different to a reading brain, and we know that because we can do MRIs and we can scan brains. Learning to read actually physically changes the human brain. And more than that, we're actually building, we're repurposing, and we're connecting these neural pathways, and doing all of that work takes a lot of time. And for some children, it will take an awful lot of practice to get them there. The optimal time for this work, that's between the ages of 3 years old and 8 years old, because that is the time that the brain is most plastic or has the most plasticity, so is amenable to having those changes take place. I don't really have time to go into the technicalities or the practicalities of the classroom today, but I did want to talk very quickly about the role of handwriting in the creation of the letterbox. Now, learning how to form letters actually activates this reading system, and this reading circuit or system is activated when we write by hand only. It is not activated when we do tracing with our finger. It's not activated when we type. So when we're getting children to do things like make 3D letters out of Play-Doh, or make letter shapes out of pasta or bits of fluff, or trace in flour or foam or sand, this is not triggering or helping build that reading circuit. And I think that's really important to know. Writing needs a prominent place in early literacy instruction. And according to Dr. Carolyn Strom, she would say this needs to start as early as 3 years old. So the science of reading in the classroom then, it's a massive area, but I want to talk about the areas that really, what's our practice, what's our common practice in Scotland, and what does the science of reading say about that practice, and just really try and compare the two. Well, one of the first things is that the teaching of reading, and although we've had so much change in Scottish education over the last 10 to 15 years, reading really has tended to stay in its own little bubble and be very much unaffected by this. Many of you watching now will remember getting word tins home to learn words by sight. Some of you might have even had a tobacco tin home. Now, it wasn't that long ago, but we're still using that same methodology. We're still sending children home with Tupperware boxes or lists of laminated words. Or my nephew, when he was in primary one, he had little envelopes full of sight words to learn. Now, sight words, it's in our DNA of teaching in Scotland, but actually, while sight words, we think they're helpful, it actually just gives an illusion of reading. It's pure memorization, and it's not really helpful in that process of building the letterbox. Also, when we are giving children reading books that are full of these sight words that they've remembered, it can look convincing. But as Stanislas Dehaene would say, he says that gives an illusion of reading. He says it's just an illusion. Actually, from research, we know that beginning readers who focus on phonics, instead of trying to learn whole words as if they are pictures, increase activity in the area of their brains best wired for reading. And you know now which area that is. You know it's the left-hand side of the brain. So here we have artist's impression, obviously, of brain scans here. It's kind of phonics versus sight words. So on the left picture here, we have a grapheme phoneme focus. So we're focusing on the letters and sounds. We have that activation in the left side of the brain. Where we have a whole word focus, where we're teaching children to memorize words by sight as if they are pictures, well, we have activation on the right-hand side of the brain. So words learned through phonics elicit neural activity on the left side and strong left hemisphere engagement during early reading or early word recognition. That's a hallmark that we only see in skilled readers. It is characteristically lacking in children and adults who struggle with reading. Where children learn words via, the whole word, the whole shape, like a picture, we can see that it's biased towards that right hemisphere processing. So if we are using sight words to teach children to read, we are actually actively programming the wrong area in children's brains. In addition, if we use multi-cueing to teach children to read, so that's your word attack strategies or guessing, look at the first letter and guess, look at the picture and guess, read on and guess what you think the word could be. If we use those sort of strategies, we're actually teaching children the habits that poor readers use. Not only that, we're impeding the orthographic mapping process, i.e. the neural pathways where your brain is connecting up the letters and the sounds. Now, I know that these word attack strategies are extremely common. I'm guessing they're used, estimating in over, I think, around 3/4 at least of schools in Scotland. Look at the first letter, sound the first few letters, break it into syllables, look at the last letters, read the sentence again, look at the picture to work out what the word is, look for a rhyme, so R-I-M-E, that means look at the ending of the word. So looking at the first letter and looking for a rhyme, these are typical analytic phonics strategies. And then the last one here, look at the shape of the word. The shape has absolutely nothing to do with reading. I can't think of a more useless strategy, sorry. Anyway, so word attack strategy is also known as multi-cueing. Let's have a quick look then at our experiences and outcomes. I'm not going to pass any judgment, but I would like you to consider, are we kind of promoting a particular type of reading instruction? I can use my knowledge of sight vocabulary, phonics, context clues, punctuation and grammar to read with understanding and expression. Bit of a mixed bag there, to be honest. I am learning to select and use strategies before I read and as I read to help make the meaning of texts clear. I'm now going to speak about the reading wars. We've actually been arguing about the best way to teach reading for over 100 years now, but the reading wars really started in the early 70s with the introduction of whole language. And for a long time, the reading wars were characterised by whole language versus phonics. And it's changed slightly over the years, to the point where now the terminology has changed slightly, and this has been a fairly recent change, but now internationally we refer to balanced literacy, which kind of under the hood or under the bonnet is analytic phonics, and structured literacy, which again, lift the bonnet underneath is really systematic synthetic phonics. Now, balanced literacy, while it may sound nice because it's got the word balance in it, it actually doesn't align with current research. It doesn't align with how the brain actually learns to read. Whereas systematic synthetic phonics, high quality linguistic phonics as well, they absolutely align with current research. So what are the elements of balanced literacy? Sight words, multi-cueing strategies and word attack strategies, levelled reading books. So those are your predictable, repetitive texts that rely on sight words, rely on the pictures, and rely on guessing to get through the book. Phonics will generally be included, but it'll be in the mix of all of this stuff, and it won't be the priority. Balanced literacy sometimes tends to emphasise meaning over accuracy. So if the word is horse, but you say pony, sometimes people say, well, that's okay because you're close enough to the meaning. Whereas on the structured literacy side, if the word says horse and you read pony, well, that's not okay. We're going to go back and say, oh, let's try that again. Let's sound out the letters and see what the word is. So what are the features of structured literacy? No sight words. Sight words aren't allowed. No guessing is allowed. Decodable books are encouraged because with a decodable book, you teach a child some letter sound correspondences, and then guess what? You give them a book that matches exactly the letter sound correspondences that you've taught them. Instead of what we have in balanced literacy, yes, I'll teach you some phonics, but then I'll give you a book that you can't read with the phonics I've just taught you. There's a whole mismatch between the teaching and then the resources that are being provided for independent reading. So these decodable reading books are great because they give children confidence and they think, I can do this because there's nothing in the book that they haven't learned. It's all letter sound or code knowledge that they've learned with their teacher, and the decodable book allows them to practice that. So it's controlled practice. It's a bit like having stabilizers on a bike, but it's just for a short period of time, P1 to P3 perhaps, and we do not restrict literature in any other sense the rest of the time in P1 to P3. It's only when children are being asked to read independently or being asked to read aloud that we make sure it's within their current phonic knowledge. We emphasise in terms of reading strategies, we have one, so it's simple. It's phonics all the way through the word for reading and phonics all the way through the word for spelling. Analytic phonics, how did it get its name? It's because it analyses whole words. So it'll start with a whole word like cat, and then it will get children to break that word down into its component parts or sounds. Synthetic phonics is kind of the opposite. It synthesises, it builds words out of sounds. So we start from part and we go to whole. So we would start teaching children individual letter sound correspondences. So we would teach as in cat, we teach a. As in apple, we teach t as in tent. And then we teach children how to blend the sounds together to make a word. Cat, cat. And really, actually, the analytic phonics part, the phonics part of analytic phonics really isn't the problem, because we do the breaking down when we're spelling in synthetic phonics. The problem with analytic phonics is this stuff. It's when we're teaching children to identify words by their shape, their beginning and ending letters, their onset and rhyme, and then the context in which they're used in sentences. So if you can't read the word, just guess, read on and guess what might fit there, what could make sense there, or have a look at the picture and guess what it could be. Synthetic phonics, it's phonics all the way through the word for reading and for spelling. The code that we teach you is actually useful for two things, and the reverse processes. We teach you the code that will enable you to read, but that same code will also allow you to spell. And I can't show you pictures today, but just to give you a flavour of what a non-decodable book would look like and what a decodable book would look like. So children would, generally speaking, be presented with these sentences at a similar stage and level. So we can see in the non-decodable side, come here, said Dad. Now, you actually need knowledge of 10 letter sound correspondences to read that. However, 3 of those are extremely tricky and unusual correspondences. It's not straightforward whatsoever. Come here. Well, normally you would be introduced first of all to O as in orange, or even O as in oval. But here we have in this word, this is code for the sound A, which is really unusual. Same here with said, said. Actually, here in this word, this is code for but also really unusual. So we're adding in a lot of complexity and difficulty for children that really doesn't need to be there, because it's not teaching them anything valuable at this point in time about how the English language works. On the decodable side, an ant sips the sap. They just need the 6 letter sound correspondences they've covered so far, and the teacher will also have taught them about the word the. Never resorting to learning by sight, always phonics all the way through the word. We point out the tricky part and we sound and blend as usual. So what about dyslexia? Well, really early intervention is key, because early identification and remediation is going to increase not just academic success and achievement, but also emotional well-being. And research actually even shows that we can prevent the incidence of reading difficulties altogether if we act early and if we use the research-informed practices. Imagine that for a moment. That's how pivotal, how serious that is. If we can actually prevent reading difficulties, we should be all over this. Poor reading ability and dyslexia, they're predictable, they are preventable, they are correctable. We can predict which children are going to struggle. It's not practical to install an MRI in every classroom, but we can tell who's going to struggle by doing, for example, a simple screener, such as a phonics screening check, like they have in England, takes 5 minutes per child, but something like that ensures that no child slips through the net and every child gets the help that they need. It's preventable if we have explicit systematic synthetic phonics instruction for every child from the beginning, and if we support the children who need more help to keep up with little and often repetition and practice, we can prevent literacy difficulties from becoming big problems. And even if we have children in our schools who are currently struggling, it is still correctable. The longer you leave it, the harder it is to fix, but it's still absolutely correctable with intensive, explicit, systematic synthetic phonics instruction. It's important to note that dyslexia is not a lack of intelligence. It's definitely not laziness. It's, with appropriate teaching methods, students that have dyslexia can absolutely learn successfully too. And the impact that dyslexia will have on an individual is going to be different for each child. It's going to depend on how severe their condition is, but it's also going to depend on us. It's going to depend on how timely we are and how effective we are with that instruction or with that intervention. We also have to be aware that emotional problems will develop if early reading instruction doesn't match a child's learning needs. Feelings of, I'm stupid, I can't do this, or feeling inferior actually start to develop before the age of 10. And after that, it starts to become difficult we can teach them to read, but it starts to become difficult to get rid of that negative self-image that they've developed. In Scotland, we have to have a serious and urgent conversation about dyslexia because we seem to be identifying more and more children with reading difficulties. And what we tend to see is that we'll provide lots of accommodations, things that will help them in their classroom life. Things like putting all your photocopying onto buff coloured paper, or giving coloured overlays, or coloured glasses, or ear defenders, or allowing children to use technology to take over these tasks, or even expecting them to write less. We shouldn't be lowering our expectations for children with reading difficulties. We should be upping our efforts. We should be upping our efforts in terms of our interventions. They should absolutely be research-based. And for children that struggle, we should be ensuring that we're doing daily consistent intervention to enable them to catch up with their peers in terms of reading. And in fact, not just catch up to the same level as their peers in terms of reading, but catch up to their IQ. And in some cases, children will be beyond their peers in terms of IQ. And the reading absolutely has to match it, has to get there. So our reading instruction has to be equitable. It's got to be beneficial for the most diverse classroom that we have in front of us. So regardless of circumstances, regardless of background, we need instruction that's going to be beneficial for all. It needs to be early. We have to avoid delays because that's the way we will avoid growing the gaps. Remember too, the plasticity of the brain, the younger we start this, the easier that job of building the neural networks is. It's got to be effective. Our time is so limited in the classroom. We need to be using the best research-informed pedagogies as dictated by science, and it's got to be efficient. We need to bring every child with us. We should be aiming for 100% of our children reading, and if you use proper research-informed pedagogies, you will get about 95% of your class reading, and you will get another 3% with little and often extra practice and intervention. So we really should be expecting to get very close to that 100%. Even children with severe and complex needs can learn to read. And systematic synthetic phonics is effective for reading, spelling and writing. This is for all children, including those who we might consider disadvantaged by their gender, their socioeconomic group, if they have English as an additional language, if they're a younger birthday, if they have additional support needs, if they have dyslexia, if they have low language or low social skills on school entry. In short, this works for everyone. It's helpful for everyone. It's harmful for no one, but it's crucial for some children. So what do we do now in Scotland? Well, we have to do something. This was in Test just last week, reporting that since the exams in 2019, there's been a 25% increase in students receiving exam support. Now, many of these will be absolutely valid reasons, but I do wonder, what are the numbers? How many children need a scribe because they can't write, because they can't read? How many children need a reader because they can't read themselves? How many children need extra time because their literacy skills aren't developed to the point where they can't do it in the time given? We need interventions that have an effect size of greater than 0.33 because these are more likely to close the achievement gap. And it's more likely to close the gap in primary 1 than it is in primary 4 if we intervene then, because reading difficulties get more significant as children progress through their school career. So the sooner we act when children struggle, the better. And just as an aside, if we're thinking about effect sizes, if we look at Hattie's effect sizes, phonics has an effect size of 0.7. Whole language has an effect size of 0.06. What you eat has a bigger impact than whole language. So the current picture internationally in terms of the science of reading, England It's the law there now, it's mandatory. You must only use systematic synthetic phonics to teach children to read. No sight words allowed, no predictable, repetitive reading books allowed. It has to be decodable. Australia, they have scrapped from their foundation curriculum multi-cueing, or 3-cueing as it's called there, along with the predictable reading books. New Zealand have announced that they're doing a review into their curriculum, and their education minister has announced that it's going to be transformational in terms of literacy, and that's going to follow the science. Canada, we know about their report. It remains to be seen what they do with the recommendations. And in America, right now, over 29 states have implemented legislation or policies relating to the science of reading. The entire English-speaking world is waking up to better reading instruction. What about us? We actually closed a 5-year petition that was lodged with the Scottish Government in May that was about this very subject, about ensuring teachers are trained in the research in the science of reading. With a national conversation coming up, this surely has got to be an opportunity. If we want to empower our children through literacy, we have to empower our teachers with the knowledge, the research, the support, the resources, the advice. We really need a new normal. You know, academic success and well-being, these matter, and literacy matters to this stuff. Life chances and what happens in your life, your literacy is going to dictate the life chances you get. And if we're serious about equity and if we're serious about social justice, it's absolutely time to listen to the science of reading. There's some websites for you there if you want to see more. I'll put them again into the chat for you. And there's also a QR code, and these are my kind of recommendations for further reading and for books, phonics programs, that sort of thing. The link is also in the chat. And I have, I think, a little tiny time for questions at the end. Okay, I can see a question here from Joyce. Thank you, Joyce. You would like to learn more about teaching reading with non-verbal pupils. Non-verbal pupils, if you're on Twitter, the person to look up is Anne Sullivan. I can put you in touch with her. I can give you her website. I don't have it to hand at the moment, but she specialises in teaching children with severe and complex needs. She actually has videos on YouTube where she shows you how to teach non-verbal children. For a young child who appears to have weak phonological awareness, would you advocate phonological training without letters? But that's a brilliant question, Katie. Actually, all the research is showing that if you're going to do phonological awareness training or phonemic awareness training, that it's most effective with letters. So I would say don't do it without letters, move straight to doing it with letters, because it gives the brain actually something to hang its hat on. Which decodable reading resources can I recommend? I better not say anything publicly, but if you follow my link or if you contact me on Twitter, I will tell you which ones I recommend. How do you teach words like common words or tricky words which aren't phonetic? Well, all of the high quality phonics programs will drip feed in the common words or tricky words or common exception words. The ones we tend to use in Scotland, like if we use Dolch's list or Fry's list, most of those words are entirely phonetically codable, easy. You know, words like jump shouldn't even be on the list. For the handful that are left, we simply point to the bits that's tricky and sound and blend the rest as usual. So, and you would teach things that make sense in a logical way. So for example, I might teach he, she, me, be, we together, and then have them on a poster on the wall as well. And say, well, in this word, this is actually code for E. So it's the E, be, e, me. And we'll teach them that way and group them in a sensible way. We just never resort to learning by sight. How and when do you teach common words? You teach them as they crop up in your programme, but also if you use something like an alphabetic code chart, and if you just Google alphabetic code charts, you can get one for free, and you just freely download them. You can make a big one for your classroom wall. You can point to the chart and you can teach any word and any code to anyone at any time as required. Oh, what are the blocks to adopting SSP in Scotland? Yeah, I think there's a few. Yes, you're on the money there. Prominent people making literacy decisions, prominent people informing the government. Also, sometimes we don't know what we don't know. My petition was closed really due to ignorance about the issues. It was actually a comment was made about dyslexia. Oh, phonics doesn't work for everyone, and it's like, well, actually, yes, it does. So yeah, we're dealing with the issue in our system of really low levels of knowledge about the science of reading. Is there any specific training available for staff? I do personally deliver training. I'm a literacy consultant. That's my day job, and I provide training in all aspects of literacy. What are appropriate interventions for those who do not yet have phonemic awareness in primary one? If they don't have phonemic awareness, don't panic. Do not exclude them from teaching. Teach them to read with phonics. Start the programme the same as everybody else. It is an indicator that they are likely to need more help and little and often practice and repetition to help them keep up with the work of the class. Do not keep them back. Please don't get them working, because phonics will give them the phonemic awareness that they currently lack. Do I agree with starting teaching reading at 4.5? It's hard to put an age on it. I would say, practically speaking, the best time for us to start is when children start school in primary one. So yes, 4.5 to 5 is absolutely doable. Dr. Carolyn Strom, she would say from age 3, children are capable of learning this. I think when we have children all together, if we want to close those gaps that are already there when children start school, then we have to teach everyone to read. And we should do that in a whole class way, because it's stuff that everybody needs to know. I should also say, oh, I'm a minute over. Thank you so much for the comments. As you could probably tell, I could speak about this all day, and I know a lot of it will perhaps go against what you've always believed about the teaching of reading. Please look me up on Twitter. I'd be happy to answer any further questions as well. My email is on the screen as well, and my Twitter handle. So thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in today. Really appreciate your time.